Welcome to the Pearson English Podcast, the show in which my pal and I chat to the most interesting and influential people in the field of ELT. I'm your host, Richard Cleave, and joining me on the panel this month are Sam Wadsworth.
Hello.
And Patrick Curry.
Hello.
Did you two have the snow this weekend?
An absolute ton of snow here, actually. Yeah. Took the kids out, made an enormous snowman, and got cold very quickly, so I had to come back home. How about you?
Yeah, we had a sprinkling here, and I introduced my cats to snow, which was vaguely amusing.
Yeah, by the time we were out there, it was just a walk through the slush, and then it melted.
You've got to get out there quickly.
Seize the day.
Anyway, let's go on with the show. Now, this month, in the second of our mini-series on diversity and inclusion, we're focusing on gender equality in the publishing industry. Now, the impact of any learning material goes far beyond simply the subject it's aiming to cover. The choice of language, the imagery, the texts, everything we include may unintentionally reinforce gender stereotypes, shaping the learner's view of how they should behave or what they can achieve. In fact, there is a wealth of evidence that early gender bias can restrict career aspirations, influence choice of school subjects, contribute to education disparity. The list is endless. So again, the question is simple. What is Pearson doing about it?
Well, here to help us answer that are two of the people behind Pearson's Gender Equality Guidelines, Rushda Khan and Sarah Bacon. Rushda and Sarah, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Hi there, thanks for having us.
Pleasure.
So, first of all, why do we need these guidelines? What are the main issues within the current education system?
So, I think most people would agree that both gender equality and gender representation are really important, but when it comes down to the detail, I think gender stereotypes can creep into the materials we produce really easily without us even realizing it. And I think even with the best intentions, there's evidence across all organizations and sectors of society that we're not quite there yet in terms of ensuring all our materials are gender neutral and showcase positive female role models. And it's hard. I think we're inheriting a whole history of stereotyping from how we present male and female roles to even the language we use. And until it becomes truly second nature, I think we need the guidelines to ensure we're being consistent and accountable in our approach.
Okay, so let's focus on the guidelines specifically. Now, they are broken into three different sections, so it's probably a good idea to look at each section in turn. The first part focuses on the way people and characters are represented in our content. Can you talk us through some of the main issues in this area and how we might address them?
Yeah, I work predominantly on qualifications, so I think that's the first thing that people see about sort of in the classroom when they're learning. So we put out a lot of support materials about what the exam papers will look like. So if we're representing negative stereotypes, then that's kind of reinforcing that negativity with the students. So we had an example recently in a qualification that was being developed of a lady called Samantha, who was 26, who was a stay-at-home mum with her two young children, which is sort of the stereotype for, I guess, sort of young mums on their own, single parents. So we looked at that and tried to change it so that it was Samantha was a full-time worker who also looked after children, to kind of give that positive stereotype that you can be a mum and you can have a career, but you still have all this juggling to do, which is more representative, I think, of people today. So we start looking at it in the qualifications and then see, are we sort of reinforcing those negative stereotypes and try and flip the way we present them.
Okay, so what are some examples of unconscious bias? This is mentioned in the guidelines. In this context, can you give us an example of unconscious bias, and then perhaps how can we address that?
Okay, so from a sort of science background, which is my background, you get a lot of students who are asked to describe a scientist will always describe basically Albert Einstein with a white coat and a man with white hair. So I know we've done a lot of work in our science support materials to show that there are lots of female scientists from a sort of vast array of different backgrounds that are very influential in science and have been through history, so that we don't always look at Newton and Einstein and those sort of stereotypical male scientists.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That actually feeds into that kind of idea that I've seen a test where people ask students to imagine a pilot or an engineer or a soldier or something, and more often than not, they seem to picture a male doing that role. So is that the same kind of area? Is that the thing that we need to tackle?
Yeah, I think you need to show that both males and females can do all of these roles. Equally, now you see a lot more portrayal on the TV of males doing stereotypical female jobs. So it's just about making sure we're not labeling people as men only can be engineers, and showing that women can do those kind of roles as well.
And presumably treating it in a way that it's normal. So not making
Yeah.
a fuss of it, not making a thing
Yeah.
of it, but that it is just something that they do in real life.
Yeah, exactly that. Yes.
Okay, so the guidelines also mention objectification. How do you define that, and why is it important?
Yeah, so I think with objectification, this is something that we sometimes stumble into accidentally, where females are presented as not having sort of agency and purpose, and we end up sort of focusing sometimes on too much on things like their appearance rather than their intentions and their behavior and their aspirations. So what we want to encourage is that people should be treated as people. Just because someone is female, they shouldn't be treated as a commodity or an object where we put undue emphasis on their appearance rather than their actual personality. So when talking about people, it's better to talk about all aspects of the person, particularly their personality rather than their looks.
So this is a classic red carpet syndrome, isn't it? When interviewers talk to female actors about what they're wearing and not their actual work.
Absolutely, and we see this a lot in the news with our politicians. And when Theresa May was Prime Minister, there was constant reference to what she was wearing rather than what she was saying. And when we have a male Prime Minister, we always have comments about what they're saying and doing, and that's what we want to flip from the outset. Both genders have an equal part to play in deeper levels than just what they look like.
So can you give us an example from any of our materials?
Yeah, I've got an example from some of our sample assessment materials that we had for, I think it's International A level in German, and there's a picture and it's sort of describe what's going on in the picture, and you've got two ladies, both of who are at a party wearing the same skimpy dress. So I think that the chat was around, oh, they must be really upset because they're both wearing the same dress. Nothing around their personality or what they might be doing. It's just about their looks, which is not our best example that we should have put in there.
So apart from objectification, what else do we need to consider when designing characters in our materials?
I think for characters, you want to think about what are they doing, what is their sort of personality, how are they going to engage in the situation that you're putting them in, whether that's a textbook or whether that's a story or whether that's an exam question. So think about how are we really portraying those people that are there.
I would also say that it's not necessary that gender is always relevant as well. So, when we have fictitious characters or we have an animal or, a dinosaur, there may be a tendency to sort of overly feminize a character by putting, long eyelashes or earrings on it just to signify that it's a she, whereas that might not be relevant, especially in fictitious characters.
Okay, so let's move on to the next section of the guidelines, and that looks at use of language. So can you tell us what some key issues are in this area?
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting part of the guidelines in particular. I think some people may not realize that even our language is gendered. And that, I guess, shows how pervasive the impact of gender inequality really is. Language is steeped in stereotyping, and many of us are guilty of this, myself included. We often default to he when talking about, someone whose gender is unknown. We use words like mankind or man-made, which is, again, indicative of men having a superior role. And even for things like jobs, gender seems to be built into some job titles that we use in casual parlance without even thinking about it. So, what we want to promote is the use of terminology like police officer rather than policeman, or firefighter rather than fireman, or maintenance worker rather than handyman. Because even though it seems like such a small thing, actually I think that contributes to unconscious bias about who can do what job.
So you've looked at gender neutral language there, but how might adjectives we use reinforce negative stereotypes?
Yeah, so sometimes I think that we tend to use adjectives that have strong associations with a particular gender, and often these are quite negative. So we would see the word hysterical being used for a woman, or shrill or frumpy, and those are words that you wouldn't associate with a man. Equally, I think sometimes these words can be quite uncharitable, even though we're trying to sort of say the same thing. So, for a man, we might say he's assertive, and for a woman, we would call her bossy. So a bossy woman is obviously a very negative concept compared to an assertive man. Why can't women be assertive rather than, this idea that as soon as they start behaving a particular way, actually they're not behaving like women ought to. And so we want to sort of flip it even in the language we're using, by using adjectives that can be interchangeable and are positive for both genders.
And if you extend that to expressions that we may use day to day, can you give us some examples of expressions that have negative implications and what we might use instead?
I think, sometimes we introduce gender to expressions, and we're sort of implying something about the gender. So, when we say things like, he caught the ball like a girl, we're saying that that's exhibiting weakness, that if the boy or man is behaving like a girl, and that's implying something negative about women in sport, for example. And equally, there's things like, the word ladylike. That's how women ought to be. It's not something you'd use for a man. And it's suggestive of something other than just purely their personality.
The report talks about the use of parallel language as well. Can you tell us what parallel language means and why it is important?
Yeah, it's just about referring to people who are over the age of 18, women, as women rather than girls, because I think a lot of the time we just say, oh, the girls were doing this, and we actually mean people over the age of 18. And also young people, referring to them as children or students rather than girls and boys, and just making sure we're being quite sort of sensible about the age of the person we're talking about, and also keeping it as gender neutral as possible. And again, if you talk about ladies, that should be used only when you're talking about it alongside gentlemen in a historical context, if possible, and not necessarily, you wouldn't necessarily want to refer to people as ladies in sort of today's society.
Yeah, I had a curiosity about that we say ladies and gentlemen, but we say men and women. And is there any consideration around kind of binomial expressions like that, like which comes first, boys and girls, men and women, but ladies and gentlemen? Are those things that you're kind of addressing, or is that just those phrases are fixed over time and should be left as they are?
Well, I don't think they're fixed. I think sort of pick the words that you want to use. So say if it is boys and girls, you could change that to children. But if you are referring to ladies and gentlemen, say in a sort of a welcoming speech, you could flip that round and say ladies and gentlemen, or gentlemen and ladies. Or if you're saying husband and wife rather than man and wife, you don't have to say wife second. You could say wife and husband first if you wanted to sort of flip it around just to make it more equal.
Yeah.
The final section of the guidelines looks at referencing third-party content. What are the main issues to address in this area?
So this part of the guidelines is related to sort of the examples that we use, and the kind of role modeling that we end up inevitably doing. So the most obvious example that comes to mind is the classic fairy tale in which the hero of the story is the strong one who saves the girl who's weak, and is only described by her appearance and so on. And I think these kinds of stories are, stories that we've all grown up with, but aren't necessarily helpful when trying to present, a gender balanced view of society. And equally, when we're looking at examples of famous people, famous scientists and other famous women in history, those are examples that we could bring up more often, and we often tend to use examples of men, but that's because women's contributions are potentially harder to find. Because women's contributions have been less visible, it's sometimes easier to pick examples of men, and I think we need to put in the effort to make more reference to female contributions, and there are plenty if you just take a look.
Yes, that actually sort of taps into something we talked about on the race and ethnicity episode of hidden stories, and how certainly with women, say in science, they just haven't been able to take the credit for the hard work that they've been doing on all sorts of things, from NASA to kind of germ theory and things like that. So you're absolutely right. It's really about thinking carefully about what we use in our books and learning materials, and how we can highlight positive stories of women being a great success.
So thinking about this practically now, what can teachers do to help in the classroom?
Yeah, so I think as a teacher, you need to think about what is the lesson you're trying to give to your students, and how can you weave women into that story as well as men, which might traditionally be there. My background is science teaching a long time ago. You give them Isaac Newton because that's what they need to learn to get through their curriculum, but you can also talk about all the other people who have helped, maybe some women that have contributed in astronomy if your subject is astronomy. So I think as a teacher, you need to go out and try and gather information on these hidden women, if you want to call them that, to just make sure you bring it in so the students get that balanced view of men and women equally in that subject.
I think it's also, it goes hand in hand with encouraging a wide variety of aspirations. I think if kids see role models in the area that they want to go into, if they see female role models, I think that really, really helps. And I think this is why this subject is so particularly important in the education industry, in that there's a real sort of trickle-down effect. So the materials we produce are the materials that children learn from, and those will impact the choices they make later in life and the people they become. So education is at the root of so much. So it really makes sense to get it right there to begin with.
Absolutely. Okay, so you've talked about the classroom there, but what about institutions? What can they do to help with the issue?
So I think as a school, the management needs to think about what courses they're adopting and what sort of texts they are bringing into the school to help teach, and maybe have a sort of balanced review of those from a gender point of view, as well as all other aspects of diversity and inclusion, so that they're not kind of forcing a particular view to be taught in their centre. So have that review of what you're actually buying in and what you're adopting in terms of qualifications.
Okay, now I think it's time to move on to questions from our listeners. Our first question this month comes from Helen in London, who asks, how do we adhere to these important guidelines and also successfully publish materials for markets that may not share the values we aspire to?
I think this is a really interesting and a really difficult question as well. I think it goes to the root of the question of, Pearson's role in a wider international context, because of course we produce materials for a wide variety of markets, all of which may be at different parts of that spectrum of gender inclusivity. I would say that Pearson as an organisation needs to have a position on this. And I think, there may be some grey areas of practical application where, of course, we need to be careful and sensitive to our markets. But at the same time, I think we have to play an active role in defining our core values of gender equality. And, in a way, I think it's these markets where we have the opportunity of making the most impact. I think as long as we can do it sensitively, by declaring a position of gender inclusivity, I think we're going to have the most impact that way.
Yeah, I think it's important not just to say you're brave and to go ahead and publish guidelines, but also then to follow through with those guidelines and have them included in the materials you publish, because it's very easy to talk about values and talk about guidelines, but then going ahead and affecting change in areas where the change might be more difficult is the next step.
Absolutely. And I think these guidelines are just one part of the challenge, we have to, continue the conversation, especially in markets where they may be more challenging to adopt. And having a culture of communication is going to be really, really important as we progress down this path.
Great. Okay, so next up is Jane from London, who asks, it's easy to see how we can influence future generations, but what about adults? Can we hope to change their behaviour, or can we just reflect how society is now?
I can answer that one. I think if you're creating a qualification for teachers, then if by putting in more of a sort of gender neutral or positive representation of females in there, the teachers themselves will then hopefully adopt that approach. And I think in terms of then what you're sort of sending home with the students as homework, then maybe their parents will see that, and that will kind of get out to the parents to see that positive representation of females as well. But I think we need to try, even if it is a really difficult thing to do, I think we need to call it out wherever we see it, and we should try and just be more positive for females rather than just say, oh, well, that's just how people are, so that's how they're always going to be. I think we need to try our best.
So we're not going to put up with it. We're going to fight against it.
Yes.
And finally, we've got a question from Donna in Italy, and she asks, where can teachers get materials to help with this?
I think we're now developing qualifications that are more positive in terms of gender, so that's where things will come from. And I think Pearson is producing other materials that are really positive from gender, so I think we can be hopefully the first place they come to. I know, for example, the science team for GCSEs in science are producing lots of support materials around women in science, and so that's somewhere they can go. But I think the material is out there. I think it's just down to the centres themselves to kind of think about what do they want to give out for their teachers to teach and be supportive, as well as Pearson being supportive.
Okay, well, that's just about all we have time for this month. Rushda, Sarah, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Where can people find out more information about the guidelines if they're interested?
We would encourage everyone to look at the guidelines. They are published on our website at pearson.com. Probably the quickest way is if you Google Pearson Gender Guidelines, you should be able to see a direct link.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, that's about it now for the show. Thank you as always to my panellists, Sam and Patrick.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And as ever, thank you for listening. For questions, suggestions, or any other feedback, please email us at pearsonenglish@pearson.com or visit our Facebook page, Pearson English. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like, comment, and subscribe to us on SoundCloud, Spotify, or iTunes. And until next month, this is the Pearson English Podcast.